Still on component lifecycle in React, in this lesson, we'll look at how to apply the concept of life cycles to functional components. So let's start by running our development server. In the previous lesson, we looked at how to apply the concept of life cycles to class components, and we saw that in React class components, there are a couple of methods that allows us to run code at different phases of a component's life. A quick summary: we had component did mount, which allows us to run code when a component is mounted. We had should component update, which allows us to decide if our component should re-render or not. We looked at component did update, which allows us to run code when our component updates, which means the state changes. We looked at component will unmount, which allows us to run code before a component is unmounted. And we had render, which is used for the mounting phase and used for the updating phase. If you haven't seen the previous lesson, definitely check it out. But moving forward, let's see how to apply all of this to functional components. So in this functional component, we used useState to manage the state for random cards, and then we have this randomize R, which we saw here is used to randomize the positions of different elements in the cards array. We have this function that when called is going to set the random cards state, and this function is called when this button is clicked. Now let's say we want you to run code when this component is mounted. How do you do that in functional components? Well, this is where you use another hook in React called useEffect. I can take this one out now since I'm not using classes anymore. So with useEffect, this hook allows you to run side effects in React components. I'll talk more about side effects in the next lesson, but you can think of side effect as your document.getElement by ID, set interval, set timeout, your fetch API, and all of those things that you run usually with the help of the browser, because the browser exposes a fetch API, and that is why you can use that fetch API. That is not something specific to React. I have a video where I talked about side effects in JavaScript. I would link it below, but also in the next lesson, we'll dive deeper into side effects in React. So now you have this useEffect hook. We have seen the useState hook for managing states. There are many more hooks in React. We'll look at that in upcoming lessons. But when you have this useEffect hook, this is how you use it. The syntax of the useEffect hook is you have useEffect, and then you have your function that you want to run. That function would often contain the side effect, and then you have your dependencies. Let's look at what this means. Let's start from the function. So for this useEffect now, we can say we want this function to run, and then here we can say console log I am born. Now when you have it like this useEffect is going to run when the component is mounted and also when the component updates. You see we have I am born when the component is just mounted on the DOM. If I update the state by clicking this, you can see we have I am born again. The more I update state, it keeps saying I am born. So this effect is going to be running on every render. If you unmount it, it's not going to run, but when you mount it again, you see we have I am born again. So it runs in the mounting and the updating phase, but you don't want this running every time. You want to decide when it should run. So if you want to run this when the component is mounted, this is where you specify an empty dependency. So the second argument you can pass to this useEffect hook is dependencies, and these dependencies are the values that the useEffect hook is going to look out for to see whether it should run again. So for example, if you should put random cards here, this useEffect is going to run when the component is mounted, and it is going to run every time random cards changes. If random cards doesn't change as a dependency, this useEffect would not run. But when you put an empty dependency array like this, it means you want this useEffect hook to run only once. In the next lesson, we're going to look deeper into the useEffect hook. I just want to give you an idea of how life cycles apply to functional components in this lesson. Now if I should open the console again, you see I am born when the component is mounted. If I update the state of the component, you can see the useEffect hook doesn't run. If I should click update state and the component is unmounted, nothing runs on the console. When I click update state and the component is reborn, it is remounted, you can see we have again I am born. So this is similar to what we had in the class component here, which is component did mount. Now what about component did update? Well, with component did update, this is where you can specify your dependencies. So here I can specify a dependencies like random cards, although because random cards is an array which is of the object type, this might cause unexpected results, but I'm going to explain deeper in the next lesson. Like I said, this is where you pass a dependency. So here we're passing random cards, which means when this value changes, then this useEffect hook is going to run again. So now if I come here, you can see first we have I am born, and then if you click on this which updates the random card state, you can see we have multiple I am born. Now we have this useEffect running in the mounting and the updating phase, but what if you wanted to run the useEffect separately for mounting phase or for the updating phase? Now this is where things can become a bit tricky. With class components, it was pretty straightforward. We had component did mount and component did update, but with useEffect it can become tricky, and I'll explain this better in future lessons, but let me just show you a solution here. So for this, I can use the useRef hook. We're going to talk more about the useRef hook later on, and then here I can create a reference and I can call this is mounted ref. Then I use the useRef hook and just pass a value of false. Here I can now check if is mounted ref.current is false. That means the component has not yet been mounted. I can put I am born here. Then after I put I am born, I can now update this is mounted ref.current to be true. And then I can now have else, and here I can say console.log I am updated. Now if I should open my console, you can see we have I am born when the component is mounted, and when we update the state, you can see that we now have I am updated. Now I know this might be a bit confusing for you, and you might be wondering, why am I not just creating a variable like let is mounted ref equals false? I'm going to explain that in a future lesson, so don't worry if this useEffect or this useRef hooks aren't making much sense now. This was why I started with class components, so that you get a good understanding of life cycles before we see how we can apply that to functional components. Okay, so we have the useEffect here running when the component is mounted and when it is updated. What about when the component is unmounted? How can you trigger a code for that phase? Well, this is where you use something called a cleanup function. A cleanup function is what you use in useEffect, which is going to be run when the component is either unmounted or before the next render of the component. So here we can return a function which is the cleanup function, and here you can do any cleaning ups that you want to do. If you remember, in component will unmount, we did some cleaning ups here, so this is the same idea with this. So here we can say console log cleaning up. Now if I should open the console, we have I am born. When you update the state, we have I am updated, but you can see that before we have I am updated, we have cleaning up. That is because this is going to be run before the next render, and the relevance of this is so that you can clean up anything you want to clean up in the current render before you go to the next render. And this would also be run when the component is unmounted. So if I should click on update state, which would unmount the pricing cards, you can see we have cleaning up again. If I click on update state, pricing cards comes in, we have I am born. You click on it again, we have cleaning up. Click on it again, we have I am born. If you update state, you have a cleanup before you get the I am updated. So let's use our set interval example that we used in this case. So let's say I have this set interval. I'm going to copy that from here and I'm going to paste it here. So when the component is mounted, I'm going to set an interval for 1 second which says hello, hi, hello. Now if I don't clean this up, you can see our interval is running every 1 second, and when the component is unmounted, our interval is still running. Well, with the cleanup now, what I can do is up here I can have let interval id, which is going to be null. Here I can say interval id equals to set interval. In this cleanup, I can now call clear interval and pass the interval id. Oh, I'm not spelling this correctly. Now we have this in this cleanup, we can clean the interval. So now you can see our interval is running every 1 second when the component is mounted, and when I click on update states, we have our cleanup, the component is unmounted, our interval is no longer running. If you click on this again and the component is remounted, you have the interval running again. If you update state, now watch, when you update state, you're also going to have that cleanup and the interval stops running. Remember again that the cleanup runs before the next render. So what we might want to do now is to take this outside. If you want this interval to be restarted in every render, you can put it outside like this. So now we can just have const interval interval ID. And now when the component is mounted, you have the interval running. When you click on this, we have our cleanup, and then the interval starts again. You have your cleanup, and then the interval starts again. Now it depends on your use case. You might only want to run this interval when the component is mounted and not when the component is updated, or you might want to run it even when it is mounted or when it is updated. It depends on your use case. There are certain use cases where you want to run a side effect on every re-render. So in the first render, you run the side effect with the current state. When that state changes to something else, you want to run that side effect with the new state. All of this depends on your use case. I'm just showing you what is possible here and how you can manage the life cycle of a functional component. Now, what if you wanted to set your interval when the component is mounted, but you don't want to clean up the interval when the component updates? Because with what we have here, when you update state and the component re-renders, you have a cleanup and then the interval starts again. But what if you only want to restart that interval when the component is unmounted? Well, in that case, you can use the useEffect hook multiple times. Just like you can use the useState hook multiple times, you can use the useEffect hook multiple times. So here I can have my useEffect again, and in this case I'm going to have an empty dependency. Let me close this for now. Remember, empty dependency means only when the component is mounted. And then in here I can have my console log I am born, and then I can also have my isMountedRef.current equals to true, and then I can remove this part here. I can take this console log inside of here and remove this negating operator. So I can have something like this, and then I can put this cleanup function instead in this first useEffect, and then I can also take this from here to this useEffect here. What am I doing with this whole arrangement? Now I have two useEffects. This is the first useEffect with an empty dependency, which means this useEffect would only run when it is mounted, and our cleanup function would run when the component is unmounted. And then we have this second useEffect where we check that the component is already mounted by accessing isMountedRef.current. So if isMountedRef.current is true, which we update here, then we know the component has already been mounted, and then we can run whatever code we want to run when the component is updated. And we have our dependency here, which means that this useEffect is only going to run when this dependency changes. So now if I open my console, you see we have I am born and we have I am updated. And the reason for that is because this useEffect is coming after this useEffect. So because this has already been updated to true, this is true, and then this part runs. So instead, we can take this to the top here. Now that we have this, if I should open the console, you see we have I am born, and then we have hello, hi, hello. So when the component is mounted, we have I am born. We update the MountedRef.current to true, which means this is now going to run when this dependency changes. And then we have our interval running. Our cleanup is not going to be called until this component is unmounted. But because we put this cleanup in this useEffect, that means a state change for this useEffect is not going to trigger that cleanup anymore. So now if I should update state, you see we only get I am updated, and our interval is still running. We don't get cleanup in the console because the cleanup function is not run for that state change. But now when I unmount pricing cards, you see we have cleaning up, and that interval is cleared. When the component mounts again, our interval is triggered again. So when you have your cleanup function, it's going to run when the component is unmounted, and as well when a component state changes and a re-render is triggered. But if you don't want to run it on every state change, then just like I showed you here, you can have multiple useEffects where one of those useEffects would check for state changes and the other useEffect will check for component mounting, and you can have your cleanup function in that component that only watches for the component mounting. So going to the class component, we have seen how to replicate component did mount, component did update, component will unmount. Of course, render is just the normal return that we have here. Constructor is specific to classes, so you don't need a constructor in a functional component. You can just go ahead to set your state and you already have your props coming in as argument. Now the only thing we haven't replicated yet in functional components is should component update, and I'm going to skip that for this lesson because it just makes things a bit more complex. We'll be involving things like memoization or some other tricks. We're going to cover this in future lessons, but I hope that you have seen how we can use this useEffect hook to replicate the idea of lifecycle lifecycle that we saw in class components. Now there is more to the useEffect hook as well as the useRef hook, which we'll look at later. But for the next lesson, let's dive in deeper into the useEffect hook, understand what side effects are, and see some examples where you'd want to use the useEffect hook in your application.